over some of the material that is already available here. All right, real quick. Again, a lot of this I'm expecting you to be bored. At least half of you should be bored with this. And so HTML, as you know, this is the ASCII format that browsers read, ASCII files, text files that they parse, and they create a domain object, right? A domain object model in their memory. So for instance, this particular HTML, you look at the page source, this is what came from the server. This is the HTML document that came from the server verbatim, and it was interpreted by the browser to render this page. Yes? To when it was interpreted, it converts it into an object. This is an object, right? It's a big object. This is the object representation of that ASCII text file, right? This representation is referred to as the DOM, the document object model, and it's a result of the browser parsing that HTML file. Yes, and each one of them is represented visually on the right-hand side on the screen. So as you hover each one of these contents, it hovers that saying that piece of text, that object that was parsed, corresponds to that portion of the screen, right? So you can put this on the right-hand side, and you can hover and see different content. So where'd you go? Where are you? Yeah, that content right there. And so it parses the HTML, and it also parses the CSS. Right, the style sheet is a different piece of document that describes the look and feel for that part of the document. So it describes that this div should have the following colors, the following margins, the following borders, the following paddings, the following colors for the text, the following colors for the background. So HTML tells you how to lay out the page, right? What is the content? Whereas CSS tells you how things should look, right? It used to be early on when HTML just came out that when it started exploding, it's used by academics that started using HTML. Everything was all together. Look and feel and HTML and logic, it was all mixed in the same page. Those fields have become mature enough and complex enough that today they're their own field of study, right? So you could just focus on design and do all your career on CSS and Photoshop and how things should look pretty, and you can focus just on the front end side, just do only JavaScript and HTML, right, for a full successful career, right? So these are complex enough careers that they can be worked on fairly with a lot of dedication and commitment. We're going to be wearing a lot of hats throughout the semester, right? And sometimes we'll be designers, sometimes we'll be JavaScript developers, front-end developers, back-end developers, and also some database developers as well. Anyway, so HTML is made up of elements. Elements are what you see here, all these pointy bracket tags, right? That tell the browser how certain things should be rendered on the page. Okay, and here's some of the simplest of these elements. Here's the HTML heading, right? That allows you to create this big pieces of content that are meant for breaking up your application or your content into different sections, right? So headings allow you to do that. Notice that most of my code here is hosted on Fiddle, on JS Fiddle. If you click on it, you can play around with the code. You can see what happens if you change the code. Or you can run it again, and you can see what happens on the right-hand side. Okay, so most of my code, most of my examples use JS Fiddle, just so that you can see what the difference is. So notice here, section 1 over here is this section 1. Notice they're using header 1, but if I change it to heading 1 instead of 3, right, you can see that it changes the size of that section to be much bigger. Yes? Trivial. All right. Let's keep going. Paragraphs are also another very common common HTML elements that also useful for breaking up your document into sections. We can see the HTML here, and we can look at it in JS Fiddle, what it looks like. Notice that if in JS Fiddle, in the HTML, you remove all this formatting, right? The browser is not going to know how to render it. So it's not going to know what format to use, right? And if you remove all that and you run it, notice that the content is just one long run-on sentence. See that? Okay. So for instance, one of the things I want to point out is that the browser ignores white spaces, right? Unless you explicitly tell them to render them in a particular way. So even though in your original HTML you might have added white spaces and new lines and tabs and breaks and whatnot, all that, the browser is going to ignore them, right? It's just going to consider them as extra white spaces, and they're ignored, right? They're collapsed into a single space. So let me put that back, right? And so here we are telling the browser that H1 is used right here, and it's big and bold, and paragraph adds additional white spaces and vertical spacing. Normally, notice the behavior here. Notice the right-hand side. See all that the content is wrapping. Okay, that is one of the mechanisms by which the browser renders content. Right, browsers by default renders content from top to bottom, from left to right. It's very Western based rendering. So notice that the content is kind of fluid. If it doesn't fit, it just wraps, right? As if it were water, right? It doesn't fit and just it occupies as much space as you give it. Okay, that behavior we refer to it as inline rendering, right? All these pieces of text over here are being rendered inline, right? One after another, and from left to right. If there's no more space, it just goes on to the next line, right? So inline, as opposed to block rendering. Like for instance, this lorem ipsum over here, if we inspect it, we'll see that it takes up the entire width of the page. Right. So if we do this and you inspect it, right, that H1, notice that it takes up the entire width of its parent container. See that? We call that block display, rendering as a block element, as opposed to each one of these elements, right? If you put here, if you put this as bold, oops, make this bold, and you run it again. Notice that there it is. See this is simply is bold, right? But it's rendering in line with the rest of the content, right? It's not all of a sudden pushing everything out and taking up an entire line all by itself, right? So those are the two major policies that browsers use to render content, right? Browsers parse the document model, and based on the type of the tag, it decides whether some of them will render as block and some of them will render as inline. Yes? So headers render in block, paragraphs render in block, bold render in inline, spans render in inline, right? And we'll learn all these as we go. Okay, but those are the two main big categories of how the browser decides what things are going to render where. And we need to be able to understand this so that we can then override, right, and decide where we want to place things exactly. All right, let's continue. Tables. So tables, they're meant for rendering tabular data. They're not meant for laying out pages. Okay. Early on, the HTML was originally intended for research papers, right, where you have section and abstracts, right, mostly just long paragraphs of explanation, and some table here and there where you would show some tabular data, right? Tabular data, right, where you have each row describes a record. Each record has the same fields, right, and you have the headings at the top. That was the original intent of tables. It was not intended, HTML, it wasn't intended for what we do it today. We use it to have kind of like online magazines and online newspapers, right? Where you have articles and snippets of content that is where you might have different columns. Yes, it's a very common thing to do. Original HTML didn't allow you to create these columns. Yes, but it's a very, very popular way of producing content. And because the original HTML didn't allow you to do that, people started using tables to do this, right? Because tables allow you to have these separate columns, right? And it became very, very popular. Today is considered to be very bad practice to use tables for laying out pages. So don't do it. Right? Do not use tables for laying out content. Only use it for its original intention for tabular data. We'll learn later how to create columns, right, the right way. Okay? Tables. Lists, very popular for just displaying long lists, either as bullets or as numbered, and they are used. They're created using the UL or the OL tags, right, for unordered and ordered, and then line items for each item that we want to list. They are by default. They render as blocks. So if you hover over the line item, notice that it takes up the entire width of the container, parent container. But is very popular today to render lists not vertically but horizontally, right? So for instance, this is a list that is being rendered horizontally as opposed to vertically. It's a very common way to show menus, right, or a list of options all together, right? And because they are a collection of things, right, it's a good practice to include them as a list. And so what we did here is that we're overriding the display here. They want to display vertically, right, as block, but here we overrode them to display inline. It says, no, I don't want you to display how you, by default, you display block. I want you to display inline. So if you hover over this one, notice that by default, right, they display as block. See that? Right, so notice that it's grayed out. It's grayed out. That means that this is reading a style sheet that is being provided by the underlying framework, which is the browser. The browser is providing this default style, right? And this style is part of the HTML standard, right? Line items are rendered as block, right? But you can override that, and that's exactly what we did here. We took all the LIs and said, no. I'm overriding the default. Notice how the display is being overwritten here. We don't want list item. We want to display them inline. Okay? And more to come on that. We have all sorts of form elements for displaying form for creating forms. Notice that some of these have different data types. Notice that some of them have date pickers. Some of them have emails. Some of them are passwords. Some of them are drop downs. So most of these are native input fields that the browser provides or supports out of the box. Some of them are, you can just type things in just plain text form. Some of them are a little more strongly typed, like email, right? So email are validated by the browser. If you don't type an email, a valid email like with @ and periods and a domain The browser will complain and it'll validate it for you. Also notice that we have date pickers. These date pickers, to implement these date pickers, let's see, these date pickers are right here. Date pickers right here. You just have to say date, the type is date. Okay, the type is date. And the nice thing about this is that if you use these types, they're also supported on the phone, right, on tablets. So just like over here, you get a date picker, right, on the browser. If you access it with a phone, right, it'll use the date picker for your particular iOS or Android or particular operating system, right? It'll use the keyboard, the correct keyboard or widget for that type, right, which is nice. If you access it on Android, it'll use Android's date picker. If you use it on iPhone, it'll use iPhone's date picker, which is pretty cool. Also, email. If you here we said that is of type email. See that? Again, that's very important, right? If you say what type it is, again, the phone will know, right, to show you the keyboard for typing the email, right? Which also it's a nice thing, right? It's a reduced keyboard, right? It already has the @ sign. It already has the .com, right? Already there, so you improve the experience, the overall experience for the user. Let's see what else. Notice that all these input fields have labels. See the labels? Okay. Notice that the labels are these over here: first name, last name, and email and whatnot. And notice that they have a for attribute. See that, the for attribute, right? And it's referring to an ID for that input field. See that? Right. So these two are linked together. This label is the label for this input field. Okay. And what that does is that obviously, if you click on the input field, it has focus, right? But also, if you click on the label that is associated to the field, it also gives focus to the field. See that? Right? And that's also good practice, especially on phones that you have, reduced screens. If you increase the area, the touchable area with a finger, right? It just makes it so much easier for somebody to use your form. Yes, to increase the area, the touchable area. That's especially true if you are using radio buttons and checkboxes, right? That are notoriously small on a small screen that you want to click on with your finger. So if you create for the radio buttons, here are the radio buttons. Where are they? Radio. There you are. So here they are. They're radios. They're a whole bunch of radios. But notice that they are together with a label. See that? The radio is inside of a label. See that? That's saying yellow. So that if I click on yellow, notice that it selects the radio. Right? Again, increase the area, the clickable area to make it easier on the user. Again, we're going to look for these things in the project, right? If you use these good practices, all right? Same thing for the checkboxes. Now, notice that the radio buttons, the intent is for them to be mutually exclusive, yes? Right? That is not free out of the box, right? You need to configure that to be mutually exclusive, especially if you have several categories of radio buttons, right? So you might have, a group of radio buttons, and then another group, and then another group, and then another, or several yes/no questions, yes, no, yes, no, yes, no, yes, no, right? And they all have to be mutually exclusive amongst each other. Yes, no have to be mutually exclusive, but they're not mutually exclusive with the next question, right? Each question is individually different, right? So to accomplish that, to create those groups, to associate the radio buttons as part of the same group, they all have to have the same name. So for instance, I have here the favorite color. What the heck? It doesn't allow me to select this. There it is. So notice that they're all part of the same group, favorite color, and that's how the browser knows that they have to be mutually exclusive. Make sense? Right? And when we get to ng model, right? The value of the radio button, right? This will be the model, right? And it'll have just one value associated with it, the one that is selected. Make sense? Right? For the checkbox, it's the opposite, right? You can also group them. You can group them by giving them all the same name, right? But the value of that attribute will be all that apply, all the ones that are checked, as opposed to radio button, right? Only the one that is checked. Okay? All right? Okay. Let's keep going. Lists, semantics, anchors. Anchors. So anchors, typically we know anchors that allow you to just navigate to one page to the next page, yes? But here's a feature that I'm sure you're already familiar with. If I click, here's a content table at the top, and as I click on the content table, it's going to jump to a section on the same page, right? So if I click on here, right, it jumps right here, or I can jump back. I can jump down and then jump back up. You can jump all the way down and then jump back up, right? That's a very common feature, right? And Wikipedia uses it all the time. You have a top level table of content. To achieve this, these anchors are using the hash mechanism. See that hash right there? Right? That hash is referring to a section declared all throughout, these sections declare all throughout the page. You see that? Right? So all these are referring to different sections on the same page. Yes? This is a mechanism that has been around in HTML since its inception, from the beginning, right? It was meant to be able to jump around on the same page without leaving the page. Yes? Well, Angular and all these model view controller libraries, this is their main mechanism for navigation, right? They hijack this mechanism, the hash mechanism, and they build an entire framework on top of this very, very simple feature. Okay? What they do is that they tell the browser, say, hey browser, never mind what you do with the hash. Okay? Instead, notify me when people click on these hashes. Right? Let me know when people click on these hashes, because I have a really good idea. Right? What am I going to do is that as people click on these things, typically they assume that they're going to navigate to a different page. That's what they assume. And so what Angular does is that it says, well, I'm a single page application. I don't really want to go anywhere, right? I really want to stay in index page. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to make you believe that you clicked on the link, right? It's going to notify me that you clicked on that link. I'll go fetch content, HTML, additional HTML under this, right, under the covers. I'll go fetch the HTML and I will inject it into the DOM. As far as you're concerned, it will look as if you went from the login page to the registration page to the profile page, right? It will look as if you actually left one page and you went to another page, yes? Right? But really, you never left the index page. You're always in the index page. Make sense? Right? So this is a fundamental concept, right, on top of which Angular builds its entire routing and navigation mechanism. Yes, it's a very, very simple mechanism that really Angular took, and all these frameworks. Also, it fixes one big problem with the way we used to do navigation on server side. One of the problems in server side technology or rendering is that we are so concerned about the back button, right? We're supporting the back button. Oftentimes, we have this caveat on our application or our server side application: please do not use the back button, right? Use our links to navigate. Don't click on the back button, right? In Angular, all that goes away because this mechanism of hashes inherently are already compatible with the back button. Okay, so if I click on lorem ipsum and then I click on the back button, it takes me back where I was. See that? Right, so if I click on why do we, right, and then I click on back, it just goes back where it used to be, right? And we'll see how that works. And Angular builds on that. So the back button issue is gone in single page applications, right? Because it's built on top of this very simple feature. Okay? All right. Oops. Did I just kill my all right, so let's just go over real quick on some of the lecture, the CSS. Again, you're responsible for looking at this video, all these videos, and going over this content, selectors and classes and IDs and whatnot. So please go over this material. The only other thing that I'd like to cover, perhaps, is the box model. The box model is the second big family of features that the browser uses to position or decide what is going to be rendered where. Okay, we already said that inline and block, right, are the two large policies, right? Whether I take up the entire width of the page, or am I flowing from left to right and I wrap. Right, those are the two big mechanisms. The second large set of mechanism is the box model. Right. So what the box model is that if you inspect any of these elements, right, towards the bottom, it renders this box. Right. It renders that box. So every element, every piece of elements is going to be associated with a box, right, or it's going to have a box model. So if I hover over this, it tells me that that paragraph has no margins. Notice that there it says dashes, has no borders, no padding, and it has the following content. Okay, and that's true for every piece of elements. If I click on this div, it'll tell me that it has a top margin of 10, a bottom margin of 50, right? Has borders all around. Which one is this? Which one is this div? I don't know which one it is. Let's see if I can find it again. Okay, it's that box right there. See that? And notice that it color codes this, right? So I put this here and here. If I hover it, notice that the color coding on the left also matches the color coding on the right. Right? So notice that it's saying that the margin is 10 above and 50 below. And indeed, you see that there's 50 down below and it's 50 above. See that? Also says that it has a border around, right? And there it is. It's the very thin border, right? It's this very small border. So margin is the white spaces in between me and the next element, right? It's what sets us apart, right? Pushes things that are near me, just pushes them around, okay? Borders is what the name suggests. It's a very thin border. You can make it thicker, right? You can make it much thicker. You can override this to be 4 pixels or whatever, 40 pixels. And there it is, right? That one's the border down below me. Or padding. Padding is the inner space, right? So inside of the box. So here's the box, and there's space outside of the box that pushes everything away from me. Then there is the box, and then everything that's inside has padding on the space in between the border and the content inside. So whenever you're going to decide how much space is actually going to take, you need to take into account everything: the margins, the borders, the padding, and the actual content of what's inside. Yes? So if there's a trick question, what's the width of an element? Then the answer is always, well, you need to tell me what the margins are. It's twice whatever the margin is, twice whatever the borders are, and twice whatever the padding is, right? You have to add them all up. Yes? So it's non-trivial what the size of something is. Everybody okay? All right. All right, again, I encourage you to go over all this we're going to start coding and using some of this stuff. All right. Let's take a short break, and we'll come back right after these messages.